In this lesson, we'll go over managing employee expenses. We'll cover configuring products to expense, entering expenses, creating expenses in the system by email, and the expense validation process. First, we'll go over some basic configuration of the Expenses app and set up products for employees to expense. Switching over to the database, we see here that the Expense app is already installed. Let's open it and then open Configuration, Settings. The only thing to change here is the expense email alias. Emails sent to the address we add here will automatically create expense reports. We'll go over how this works in more detail later in the lesson. Next, let's open the Expense Products configuration menu. Here we find a few expense products that I created off-screen. Expense products are products like any other, but fewer fields are used. They can be configured from the Products menu by checking Can be expensed on the product form or here in the Expense app. Let's open a product to see how it's configured. We'll need to select the product type and the unit of measure. The price we set here is less important because the price on many expense products varies, and so the employee who submits the expense report will fill in the price paid. What is important is the internal reference. This is used to create expense reports by email. Next, we'll need to make sure that the employee record is configured correctly. So let's open up the Employees app and then open the record for Ronald here. There needs to be an email to send expenses by email. And in the HR tab, there needs to be either a regular or a portal user linked to this record. And indeed, we find a regular user linked here. Now that we've configured expense products and an employee, let's go back to the Expense app to walk through the user interface. Here in the My Expenses menu, each user can view their expense statements to be submitted, any expenses that have been refused by their manager, and expenses that have been already submitted. If you have HR officer level access rights or higher, you can access an overview of the expense reports awaiting your validation or refusal. As an accountant, from the Accountant menu, you will be able to see the expenses that need to be posted and expenses that need to be reimbursed to your employees. Again, as an HR officer, you can also see an overview of all expenses submitted by all of your employees, approved, pending, or rejected. Now let's enter some expenses into Odoo. We'll be entering expenses logged in as a user, Ronald. He has employee-level access rights to the Expense app, as we can tell from his menu bar, which only lists his own expenses. Let's go ahead and create some expenses. Let's say we flew to London to meet with an important client. We'll add the travel expenses product and then enter the price we paid. The bill reference is a text field that can be used to enter an order or invoice number from the expense. We'll leave this blank in this example, but fill in a date. Here we can choose whether the expense was paid for by us, the employee, or using a company card. If we choose company, we won't be able to be reimbursed for this expense later. We can also upload documents for proof of the expense. Usually this would be an image of a receipt, but the system accepts any file type. For example, a PDF of an invoice. Here we can submit the expense to our manager, creating an expense report for just this one expense. But we can also group multiple expenses together into one report before submitting them. In our example company, we submit expense reports at the end of every month, so let's just save this expense and then create another one to see how to group them together. This is the same process as the first expense, so I'll fast forward through creating it and then hit Save. Now, if we use the breadcrumbs to go back to the Expenses to Report list view, we see the two new expenses we just entered. But before we submit these expenses to our manager, let's create one more expense by email. So let's open up the email account of Ronald Sideways. We'll compose an email, sending it to the expenses email alias we added in the Expense app settings. Then we'll attach a photo of our receipt. This will be added to the Documents section of the expense. Odoo interprets the subject line to populate the expense fields, so it's important to format it correctly. First, add the internal reference of the expense product in brackets. This determines which product will be used. Next, add a description. This is the title of the expense. Meeting lunch with client. Third, add the price, without currency symbol, to the nearest cent. This is the unit price. Then in the email body, we'll add any notes. So let's send this email and switch back to our database, where we find our new expense, meeting with client. And if we open it, we see that the product, the price, and the description from the email title have all been filled in automatically. And the attachment shows up in the Documents menu, so we can review it. So now that we've entered these expenses, we can group them together and submit them as an expense report. But before we do that, let's quickly go over the process for validating expenses. First, an employee enters expenses and then submits them to their manager. We just went through entering expenses, so now let's submit them. Back on Ronald's Expenses to Report screen, we can select the expenses we want to report, then click Action, Submit to Manager. This brings up a form for creating an expense report. We can summarize it briefly, add, remove, or create expenses, and attach documents. Saving the report submits it to your manager automatically. In the top right corner, we can see the status of the report is Submitted. Next, Ronald's manager will need to approve or refuse the expense report. So let's switch back to the administrator account with HR officer access rights. Notice that there a new menu item, To Approve, is now available. Opening this menu brings up a list of expense reports that need to be approved. Here we see the report we just submitted as Ronald. We can open the report to review it, look over any documents, and then approve it or refuse it. When we approve it, the status changes here. The last step in the validation process is the role of the accountant, which is to post the expenses to the general ledger and reimburse the employee. So let's log in as Chris Herman, our accountant. Chris has access to the Accountant menu, which lets her review expenses to post and expenses to pay. If we open the Expenses to Post menu, we find Ronald's expense report. Let's open it and post the journal entries. This changes the status of the report to Posted and lets us create a payment by clicking here. It also lets us see the expense report in the Expense Reports to Pay menu, where we can again open the report, then click Register Payment to bring up a payment form where we can enter the payment details. Validating the payment changes the status of the report to Paid. This concludes the lesson on employee expenses. Thanks for watching.